So you are going to hear about The Great Escape. Your friendly chair is going to be Charles Leadbeater, author, thinker of thoughts, critic of much of what's going on in the economy and how it affects people in their lives and so on. But in his own words and in person, ladies and gentlemen, will you give a very warm welcome to your chair for this session, Charles Leadbeater.
Thank you. Well, Gareth, thank you very much for that. And it's great to be here. And ironically, I instigated this idea about this panel on escapism because of football. So I was doing a presentation in Norway, to a conference in Norway about 10 years ago, and the guy after me was the marketing director of Manchester United Football Club. And he did a thing with the audience, and he said, what is it, do you think, that we are selling people? What is our product? And people said, well, football. And then they said, drama, history, inspiration, beauty, skill, talent, so on and so forth. And he said, yeah, we're selling all of that, but actually what we're selling is escapism. Because for 3 hours, when people, mainly men, but not only men, come to football, they escape all of their other identities, and they assume this other sort of visceral identity, which allows them to escape from who they are. And that made me think, well, if you sort of recategorize the entire economy into sort of escapism sectors and realism sectors, what other escapism sectors would there be? So I started sort of thinking about that a bit. And of course, why are all our bookshops full of mindfulness books? Because basically mindfulness is a way to escape from both the past and the future into a kind of perfectly balanced presence. It's a way to sort of escape from all the stresses and strains around us. If you go to Silicon Valley technology always arrives as a story before it arrives as technology. And what is Silicon Valley's latest kind of obsession? It's death. How to escape death through transhumanism, posthumanism, extending life, so on and so forth. Very good book recently called To Be a Machine, which traces that. In it, one of the characters says, death, it's so mainstream. In other words, actually, why wouldn't you want to escape death if you could? So, of course, escapism then, not just cultural, but political. So, Brexit, a fantastic example of a sort of essentially escapist politics. We'd like to escape the EU, we'd like to escape who we are, we'd like to escape all these entanglements. And so what has been happening at Chequers over this weekend with the meeting of the cabinet is basically the committee for a failed escape. Basically, they've been coming to terms with the fact that they aren't actually able to escape in the way that they were. So it's as if they've all gathered in Stalag Luft 10, and they've dug their tunnel, and it's hit rock, and they're all coming together and saying, oh shit, what do we do now? So I'm interested in escapism and its sort of influence through culture and politics, and that's what led to the question. But I'm also interested in whether there's not just the forms that escapism might take, but whether there's a normative dimension. Is there good escapism and bad escapism? So, bad escapism, the classic example of bad escapism, the most glaring, the most alarming, is the opioids epidemic, where an entire industry has sold communities a drug which drives them into utter oblivion, and they kill themselves, basically, by poisoning themselves. That is the most extreme. A sort of less extreme version of it would be, if anyone here, I mean, you all look incredibly sensible, so I'm sure that no one here has consumed an entire bottle of white wine in an hour on a Friday night. But that's a kind of escapism where you kind of obliterate yourself. And it's a sort of negative thing, because actually, you don't get anywhere by it. You find yourself back where you were, and probably with a hangover. And so does that contrast then with good escapism, which opens up all sorts of new possibilities that you could become a different person? So Alain de Botton, in his book about travel, The Art of Travel, basically says, We travel to find ourselves. We go to other places to find other places, but fundamentally what we're trying to find is ourselves, and that is a way that you regenerate yourself and new possibilities open up. And so one of the things that I'm interested in the relationship between Occupy the Future and that theme and this, is whether escapism is an absolutely essential thing, and we haven't got enough of good escapism, which opens up utopian possibilities. So I'm joined by our stellar panel, Sarah Churchwell, author of Behold America, The American Dream and America First, professor of American literature, cultural critic, cultural behemoth.
I'm a behemoth?
Yeah. Pat Kane, lead curator of FutureFest, and author of the very influential Play Ethic, which was about the ethic of play to release ourselves from the constraints that we often impose upon ourselves. And Amrou Al-Kadhi, performer, writer, critic, and general amazing person.
Oh, thanks.
There we go. And I'm going to start with Sarah, come to Amrou, and then go to Pat, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion.
Okay. So I thought I would just, no, you know what? I'm going to stay seated because I like my swivel chair. But I will swivel in it. So I just wanted to offer, so I'm going to spin while I talk. I wanted to offer, this is really fun, some thoughts about how I approach escapism as a professor of literature. It's something that I think about a lot in terms of how narrative works and imaginative storytelling in particular, like the woman who loves Harry Potter, right? But the example that I like to use when I'm talking about escapism, particularly with students, is The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is a really interesting one because it's a story about escapism, and it kind of enacts the process of escapism, right? And it literalizes it. So, and it literalizes a lot of things. One of the things that it literalizes is the ambivalence of escapism. And I think, it's important to make a distinction between escapism and escape. Escape is pretty straightforward. You're out, you're gone, you're there, you're liberated, you're somewhere else. It's the escapism manqué that Charles was talking about in terms of Brexit, or, and storytelling is always going to have that element of ambivalence involved in it because you never leave completely. You're still in your real world, and it's a temporary respite at most, and you can be interrupted and all of those things. So, but there's also an ambivalence about whether you really want to leave, and do you really want to be in this fantasy space, especially because that fantasy space, if it's imagined richly and deeply, will have bad things in it, in the normative part that Charles was talking about. It will have violence, it will have threat, it will have things that are frightening, it will have horror. And again, Harry Potter, an excellent example of that, right? You're escaping into a world that has danger, that is frightening, where bad things happen. So do you really want to be there, or would you rather be back at home? And The Wizard of Oz literalizes that ambivalence in the sense that Dorothy wants to leave home. It's a kind of rite of passage story. It's a growing up story about a little girl who's ready to leave home, but she's not ready to leave home, and we know that because she takes her house with her, right? She literally takes it with her and weaponizes it. And then that becomes the way that she can start to imagine what it would be like to leave home. Now, I'm actually talking here more about the novel than about the film, but of course everybody knows the film. And if you think about the film, it has a really interesting message when you think about what it's saying. Because the whole point about the opening of the musical is how gray and bleak and it's sepia and it's old and it's dark and it's grim and they're in the Dust Bowl. And Dorothy wants to leave that, and then she goes to Technicolor. She goes to this incredibly fabulous place where animals talk, and yeah, some bad things happen, but it isn't because the bad things happen that she wants to go home. She only ever just wants to get back where she belongs. And then by the end, having dreamt of a world over the rainbow, an image of ambition, of aspirationalism, of escape and escapism, of trying to be bigger and better than you are and having a better life, what does she conclude? That she was best off where she was. So escapism seems in that story to work to actually say that you should settle for less, that actually it's ameliorative. And that's how I think escapism usually works. It actually makes you feel better about the world that you live in. It's therapeutic. It's a respite, but it can also mean that you come back with a different emotional relationship to the reality that you left for those few hours. And I just want to give one other example, and then I'll stop. Because we talk in terms of escapism, we think often in terms of utopia, and again, that's something that, that Charles was gesturing toward, the utopic possibilities of imaginative escapism into this other and better world. But there's also, right now, people are thinking a lot about dystopia, and we're telling a lot of stories about dystopia. And I've been thinking about what the pleasures of dystopia might be. What are the escapist, why do we like dystopia? And I'm wondering whether there isn't actually an escapism built into dystopia as well. Even though it doesn't feel escapist, it feels like you're going into the worst possible imagined space. And so what's escapist about that? And it feels like it's actually coming to terms with grim reality, facing the realism, the reality principle by really looking at the consequences of it. But I wonder whether there isn't a psychological effect where we come back from watching The Handmaid's Tale or reading 1984 and think, well, at least it's not that bad. So things are actually maybe okay. And that could be the therapeutic pleasure of going into dystopia. So I think we need to be cautious about, we need to recognize that escapism, even when it feels like it's challenging us, it may be acting in ways that we're not entirely conscious of. And if we want to think about it in terms of its relationship to political realities, I think we need to think through those processes. So those are, I think, some of my
Because you
observations.
never actually leave.
Well, exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so is it working as a kind of proxy for action, for actually leaving, for actually pushing beyond, as with Dorothy, for actually saying, okay, I'm actually going to get out of Kansas.
Yeah.
I am going to leave Kansas because this sucks. And I'm going to go to New York and I'm going to, you know, sing and dance like, as Judy Garland,
Yeah.
you know.
So, but watching something like Handmaid's Tale or what is that zombie thing?
Yeah, or The Walking Dead or
Walking
Man
Dead.
in the High Castle.
Yeah, yeah. But what about Black Mirror? Because Black Mirror, it seems to me, is a dystopia which has made people really think critically about current reality.
Yeah.
And isn't kind of, you know, blissful, therapeutic.
Yeah.
It's a critique.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so is The Handmaid's Tale, right? But what I'm suggesting is that critique can actually, it seems to me that there's a possibility that critique can actually work perversely to make us feel more comfortable with where things are now by saying, well, at least it's not as bad as The Handmaid's Tale.
It's not as bad as that shit.
And yeah, exactly. Instead of saying we need to fight it tooth and nail because it's bad enough as it is.
Yeah. Amrou.
Hello, everyone. When I was 13, my identity felt more fragmented than ever before, and most nights I would dream about a new world to escape into. I just recently moved to the UK from the Middle East and was struggling to negotiate the interplay between my Iraqi heritage and, you know, my newly found British identity. I was also realizing that I was gay and genderqueer and was feeling dysphoric with my male body and was just dreaming about my mum's clothes the whole time. And that felt at odds with you know, my conservative Muslim upbringing and the really kind of gendered household in which I was raised. But that same year, I happened to stumble upon a local marine aquatics shop and was immediately spellbound by the formless nature of the free-flowing corals and the iridescent hues of all the majestic fish. And it was like encountering a sort of fragment of myself in something else. It was kind of like being reunited with a long kind of lost Horcrux I didn't even know I had. I was so seduced by what I saw that I actually got a weekend job at that aquatic store and then ended up keeping my own marine aquarium at home and was so inspired by how, you know, a starfish would be able to have multiple legs working in a harmony that my identity still hadn't been able to find that sort of level of fluidity. There are sea slugs that are always changing gender, shape, color, and size, and I yearned to find a space like that one day. Now that I'm a non-binary Arab adult, I've come to realize that marine world lives sort of among us all the time. When I was a student, I became really obsessed with quantum physics, which is this really beautiful, disruptive and fantastical sect of physics that really ruptures what we thought we knew from classical Newtonian physics. I kind of think of quantum physics to Newtonian physics as queer theory to heteronormativity. Whereas, Newtonian physics is really fixed on what are the underlying physical rules of our universe that we can absolutely understand so that we can know. Quantum physics tells us that we can't really know anything and that those fixed laws of governable reality are just an illusion. So for instance, with quantum physics, you're looking at the subatomic particles, not the kind of macro constructs of our world. And we see that it's full of contradictions. You can fire an electron through a wall with two holes, and you would assume when you observe it that it would go through one or the other hole, and that happens when you observe it. But when you actually look on a subatomic level, there's instances where it's going through both at the same time. So there's multiple versions of the same event constantly happening, but reality sort of estimates one version of the other. So I'm really comforted by quantum physics because it tells us that reality is a set of approximate constructs that belie what's really going on a quantum subatomic level. It's in that kind of fabric of space-time as just a series of entanglements that I've been able to bring my own identity into one formless, cohesive mass. I've recently been going back into my own past, which was once really fragmented, and rescuing it with this new queer hindsight. I now paint my mother on my face so that she's no longer a sort of villain in my head, and I've reread the Quran with queer hindsight and read all about kind of Sufist Muslims who wear skirts as they kind of connect with God, and it's all about diverse bodies. And it's sort of by escaping into what was once a fractured past that I've been able to create a new reality on my own terms.
Amazing. So can I just pick up to a couple of things? So this sort of marine aquatic world and also the quantum world, these are sort of scientific metaphors for a world in which you can be many different things. And they're sort of plastic, or they shift. They're not fixed, or they're only fixed when they're observed in a particular kind of way.
Yeah, they're only fixed when they're observed, and they're not limited by shape, size, or gender. And it's interesting with talking about sci-fi and stuff, why Blue Planet, I think, really captured the nation. I kind of feel that in such a dystopic, terrifying time, there was a lot of comfort just watching this alternative world, which was not as restricted and as hegemonic as our own. You had interspecies collaboration. I mean, you basically had marine socialism going on, and you had you had there was an episode with a trans fish, and they didn't get attacked for it.
There were sharks.
There were sharks, but
but it's a different world. That's what partly what fascinated us about it.
Exactly.
And so again, it's back to different worlds being created in which we can be different people. But there's a more fundamental thing about quantum physics, which is actually we're in many different places all at the same time, and we're all over the place. And in a sense, is what you're saying, you wanted to become a sort of quantum person.
I feel that quantum physics is actually philosophical proof that constructs don't work. Like, I feel like it proves fascism's a problem, because that belies the quantum multiple nature that's actually inherent in every subatomic particle of the world.
But when you were 13, when you were 13, you were definitely trying to escape from an identity that had been kind of, in a way, you had no choice over. Is that right?
I actually had a nervous breakdown where I was having panic attacks where I would feel really anxious in my body, and then the world around me would become really two-dimensional. And then I thought a tear was about to happen because I thought the world is a piece of paper.
I think England have scored. I think it might be 1-0.
An alternative version of this space right now. And kind of just felt that I was about to fall through this hole, and I used to get really, really panicked. I've got friends here who are actually around during that time. But I actually believed I was a prophet for a moment, but actually, I think I was on the right track. I think there was a quantum thing going on.
And so, just quickly, are you still trying to escape, or have you now found a sort of way of being which allows you to get beyond escape?
Yeah, I don't really think of escapism as leaving, actually. I kind of think of escapism as going there and then bringing it to this reality to kind of create a space that's more hospitable here.
Pat, play.
I suppose I'm going to start by resisting your normative ambition for good or bad escapism. Because I was actually thinking my consumption of science fiction on Netflix would on the surface fit your model. So my good escapism is watching Star Trek Voyager, or the most recent series, Star Trek Discovery, and loving the way that it rolls out to the end of this grand and integrated solution with better technologies, better people, and a better universe. You know, the bad escapism is Altered Carbon. Did anybody watch that? Good Lord. I mean, that's dystopic at the molecular, subatomic level. This is what happens when you can control everything, and unfortunately you have the morals of Nietzsche, as Paul Mason was talking about the other day. But I keep thinking about, I'm interested in play, and I'm interested in play in the human condition and in the evolved human condition. What was the functionality of sex, sleep, and play? Not obvious, but it must do something because it's there in the evolved condition. And I also was thinking about Bruno Bettelheim, the psychologist, who brought out a book called The Uses of Enchantment. And this was all about what fairy stories did for kids. You know, and the taboos and the boundaries that are explored in a great Grimm tale or a great Hans Andersen's tale. And this gets down to the kind of my slight problem with a good or bad escapism, because good and bad escapism is what helps develop us in the moment of play. You know, human beings need play, sleep, and sex because we're really complex. We can think in a meta way. We're super conscious with each other. We can lie to each other and strategize with each other. And that makes us incredibly difficult to live with each other socially. So we do need a zone in which we can figure out how to live with each other. Because and it'll be rich and fabulous because we'll do art and we'll make great buildings and we'll cast great laws and we'll create great institutions and we'll make great culture and that. But it's going to be stressful. So we need a space wherein we can rehearse different forms of being, because to be human is to generate different forms of being, because that's what we have. And so good, to me, the thing about good and bad escapism is that we need the good and the bad at the same time. Me watching Altered Carbon and watching Star Trek Discovery on the Netflix channel in a moment of leisure with my bottle of white wine, which I consume over the hour.
Sure.
You know, this isn't, you could call that leisure. We used to have a work-leisure distinction. I think we have to think about that a wee bit more, because the leisure is upgrading. You know, the narratives and the stories and the worlds that popular culture is serving up to us are actually much more sort of functional and are uses of enchantment in order to figure out how we step out into a world where everybody's self-conscious, everybody has a supercomputer in their pocket, everybody's aware that they're in a planetary situation, everybody's aware that you have to figure out how to live on that. I mean, the actual cognitive and emotional demands of being a functional human, at least I would say anywhere on the planet, but let's say the developed West, is super high. And I think the reason why we're looking at high quality, call it escapist literature if you want, I think it's as much engagist literature as escapist literature, because I think we're on a transition towards something, and we have to grow and develop. And actually, the good and the bad stories of escapism are both functional in helping us be adaptive and ready for whatever the hell is coming down at us over the next 20, 30 years.
So just one question for you, Pat, and then I'm going to ask Sarah and Amrou a question, and then open it up to a kind of general discussion. But I suppose one of the things that is this part of what you're getting at, that there is a sort of moralizing aspect to escapism and leisure, that there are certain morally approved forms of escape.
Rational recreation, the Victorians used to call it.
Yeah, and there's a long history of that kind of thing, that you're supposed to do this in a sort of character-forming way, and so mindfulness and all of this is to escape in a way that builds your character and so on and so forth, whereas I mean, the current millennial generation is also, to some people, regarded as rather abstemious and frugal and kind of non-escapist in some kind of ways. Sarah, Amrou, just quickly, both of you, where do you look for sort of utopian escapism? Kind of where the imagination works to imagine completely new and different, better worlds?
That's a really good question. I mean, I would be interested in other people's suggestions for that, because I don't feel like it's something that I'm seeing a lot of in a way that I would recognize as utopian properly. Where I am seeing it, and this is where I would differ with Pat, I think there is, and I agree that it's too simplistic to think about good and bad, and of course the question is what are we trying to achieve? And, but that there, some people's utopia is another person's dystopia. And the attempts in my country, I mean, I've just written a book about ethno-nationalism, the attempts in my country to create what they view as a utopia of all white people, that's very bad escapism, right? In my view, very, very bad indeed. Now, they think that's a utopia, and that's built on a very false version of the past, which is a very mythical version in which there was ever a white America. I mean, hello. It's based on profound fantasies and myths about the nature of whiteness, the notion of what the United States of America is, where it comes from. But to them, what they're trying to create by ripping babies from their mothers is what they would call a utopia. Now, to me, it's a dystopia. So the places where I see hope are, I think we're in a moment where the political realities are so frightening that it's not about building a utopia. It's about fast remedial action, and it's about finding ways to restore or build new systems in which we can operate. So I think we have to move away from the big utopic visions right now, personally, and toward making sure that children aren't in cages. I mean, let's focus on those.
No, absolutely.
And then we can have some utopic visions about how we might build. For me, that's
okay. So I'll come to Amrou, but let's just hold two things there. One is, do utopic visions have to be big? Actually, utopic visions can...
Look, America's a utopian vision, right?
Well, it is, but actually utopic thinking can take all sorts of different forms.
Sure, so it's an ideal, right? So if we're talking about, so as I say, I mean, the founding principle that America would be a place that protected equality and justice and democracy, that's a utopian ideal. It has never been achieved. The United States has never achieved that, but it doesn't mean it should stop trying. So I think we keep trying to build toward that ideal.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing just to bear in mind is the sort of critique of the reductive, progressive, liberal position, which is we're realistic. You'll be £4,000 worse off, therefore vote against Brexit. Yeah. And that doesn't connect with any kind of fantasy or imagination or utopia or feeling.
Or aspiration.
Or aspiration. Amrou,
yeah, I mean,
where do you look?
Where do I look? I think it can be exhausted to look for the macro utopia. I definitely felt a lot of disappointment when I came out of university as a queer person, and I was looking for some kind of ideal utopia where I would meet my people, and that people keep disappointing you. You realize that white supremacy is even in the white liberal left and everywhere, and so for me, utopia is it starts kind of as a project of the self. I read a lot about Foucault, and it's the aesthetics of the self, and starting with just reimagining your own identity in a way that works for you, and to find out what you're resisting in terms of public discourse and what you're aligned to. And I think a lot of people don't look inward. Like Audre Lorde writes about this a lot when she talks about no one ever talks about their own inner beasts. I'm doing this exercise with a friend at the moment where if we've thought something racist, we'll just say it out loud in a public space. Be like, I thought a racist thought there. Or I'll be like, oh, I think I just did something quite misogynist. And it's been really liberating for going, oh, okay, that's something that I've systemically inherited, and I can examine that.
So let's just we've only got a few minutes, Pat, so you'll have one chance at the end to come back. Who's got a question or a comment?
So this is for Professor Churchwell.
Call me Sarah.
Caroline Fraser recently published a biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who is the author of the Little House on the Prairie series in America.
Yep.
And she mentions a bit about The Wizard of Oz, as you did in your opening, and also P.T. Barnum and his success, and the way that escapism was really integral to the experience of the early settlers in the U.S. Who were moving west. And I wonder if you had thoughts about the way that concept may be really tied to the historical truth and maybe the historical myths in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you're right. I mean, the history of the settlement of the United States by European peoples is a history of escapism, right? So, I mean, you can even just take the Puritans for one example, but of course there were commercial dreams there as well, and the Dutch sailors coming, for mercantile reasons, and then the westward movement, as you say, was very much for some people, and was an escapism purchased at the expense of other people, right? So. Native peoples increasingly get, marched out, cornered, put into smaller and smaller and smaller reservations as white Europeans, move further and further west. And of course, that was the whole logic behind the idea of the closing of the frontier in 1896, when Frederick Jackson Turner said this is going to change the United States because we've run out of space. So there's no more possibility of that kind of escapism. And so I think it raises the question of how does the country renew itself when it no longer has that pressure valve that he's talking about, that if things got bad, you just lit out for the territory, and now you can't do that once it's settled. So I think 100 years ago, he put his finger on something that we haven't solved. How do we create that possibility of renewal from within without destroying what we have? And we haven't worked it out.
Another question, comment.
It's also a great book, that Carolyn Fraser book. It's terrific.
Here we go.
Thank you. Amrou, this is, I think, going to you, but when you said that one of the things you're doing is now going back into your own past and reconstituting it, it made me wonder about the extent to which so much of our escapism is precisely about discomfort with the stories we tell ourselves about how we got to where we are, and actually how good escapism requires at some level a reconstitution of those fragments to tell better stories. I should declare an interest. I'm a historian, so the future stuff is not for me.
No,
Let's just take one more. Have we got another? There's one over here. Yeah?
Yeah, we're not the ball sports ones, are we? I was just wondering if we'd spoken about temporary autonomous zones, because you were speaking about Sufism, and it was an idea that was coined by a Sufi scholar. And it's basically about, it's an anarchist concept where we don't wait for a revolution, we create spaces in the here and now. And there's a beautiful quote. Are we who live in the present doomed never to experience autonomy, never to stand for one moment on a bit of land ruled only by freedom? And you can see these spaces all around. I was just wondering, firstly, if it's a concept you've come across, or if
What's
it's
the concept
feeling
again? Just
temporary autonomous zones.
temporary autonomous zones.
Yeah,
can
and if you haven't, have you experienced spaces like that?
So Taz. So we're constantly looking for temporary autonomous zones, I think, aren't we? And we hope that culture is going to provide them. So because we're almost into extra time, I'm going to go to Pat, and then to Amrou, and finally back to Sarah.
I was just thinking about superhero franchises, the Marvel universe and the DC universe. And very briefly, there's a big message coming through these moments of escapism. I think it's actually engagism. And one is the world matters because the whole universe fights over it, right? Yes, it's mostly the American world, but the whole universe fights over the fate of the planet. And has anybody seen Infinity War, Avengers Infinity War? At the end of Avengers Infinity War, an entity is so powerful that at the subatomic level, it can identify half of a population and turn them to ashes. And literally, the closing scene of this movie, which is supposed to be as escapist as possible, is basically a recreation of a Hiroshima, an atomic bomb blast, where bodies literally flicker off into ash, and all your favorite superheroes flicker off into ash. Now, it's no spoiler, there's a time reversal mechanism in the movie, so they'll be safe in the next one. But it's an operatic moment. It's proper popular culture as opera. And there, I'm left at the end of an entertainment franchise with an image of evil, but evil consequent upon organized science and superpowers and advanced. So it's about as ethical a movie as I could conceivably imagine, which says to human beings, you have the power to destroy, what will you do with it?
Amrou.
To follow up on your point, yes, I do think delving into your own past is a really political thing to do. I mean, I realized how Islamophobic I was at the age of 18 because of what I had experienced, little bits of what I've experienced. And I actually realized I had remembered things wrong in the Quran to align with the narrative I was telling myself to white British people. Yeah, it's this, it says this in the Quran, just feel sorry for me, I don't want to talk about it, whatever. Like trying to give a really simple teleology to kind of deal with how fragmented I was. And I was really worried when I started to do a lot of that rereading to think, how many things have I remembered wrong because of those simple narratives we try and tell about ourselves and to ourselves? So I do think before even these grand utopias, like really digging into our own systemic memories and everything is really key to understand where everything's formed. And temporary autonomous spaces, did I get it right, are good spaces to do that in, I suppose. Drag shows for me are my escaping into a new gender for a night. It's temporary, but I learn a lot about myself and get to repair things too.
Thank you, Billy.
Sarah, finally.
Well, I would say that it kind of takes me back to where I began, which is that for me the key is the word temporary. That if it's not temporary, it's not escapism; it's escape. And so that the consolations of escapism are very, very important. And they can be liberatory. They can also be therapeutic. They can just be, as I said earlier, a respite from suffering. To just take a break from grief or rage or fear and just go somewhere safe, like books that you loved as a child. That's a very important break that we can give ourselves. Then it can also be liberatory and emancipatory. But the key is that we have to come back, and then there has to be engagism. You can't have constant escapism, and the attempt to create a constant escapism is when you start to get into those perversions I was talking about. When you try to. So I've been thinking a lot about. Brian Cox had a great line on Twitter the other day. This was about Brexit, but it applies, I think, to the fascists as well. In my country, he said, you can get people to vote for you and we're going to do physics as well. You can get people to vote for you by promising to abolish gravity, but they're going to be really pissed off when they hit the ground.
Yeah.
The reality principle doesn't go away just because of escapism.
Yeah. So I'm interested in this temporary autonomous zones idea. So one person to read who's an interesting counterpoint to some of what we've talking about is Wendell Berry, who's got this book, World Ending Fire. It's a collection of his essays. And he's a sort of rural radical. And for him, his life on this farm in Kentucky is a permanent autonomous zone because he's escaped all of corporate America and so on and so forth. It's very interesting. But one of the people we talked to as we were developing this was Ruth Levitas, who's a professor of political philosophy at Bristol, who's got a great book called Utopia as Method, which is a defense of utopian thinking and precisely a sort of defense of going into temporary autonomous zones in music, culture, political thought, literature, in order to reinterrogate current reality. Thank you very much for being with us. Please join me in thanking our great panel. I hope you've enjoyed it.